My name is Dr. Kari Finley, and I am a senior research scientist at the Center for Health and Safety Culture at Montana State University. I'm excited to be with you today to explore the science of stigma. We are going to record this webinar today so that we can put it on our website, but thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. It'll be fun. We know that there are many negative consequences associated with stigma. Because of stigma, researchers have found that people might not get the help that they need or stick with the treatment that they've been prescribed. In fact, stigma has been identified as one of the greatest problems facing the entire mental health field. Stigma decreases quality of life. It negatively impacts a person's sense of hope, their self-esteem, and their self-efficacy. To sum it up, stigma has detrimental effects on a wide range of outcomes. But what if we could eliminate stigma? What if our actions could reduce the negative consequences associated with stigma? What if stigma didn't exist? I venture to guess that a world without stigma would be more accepting and more proactive, and would alleviate the suffering of a lot of people. Individuals, families, helping professionals, prevention specialists, stakeholders, and really everyone in our society has something to gain from addressing stigma and working to eliminate it. Each of us has a stake in this outcome. Just for a moment, imagine what it would be like to eliminate stigma. To get behind that idea and collectively move us forward in pursuit of eliminating stigma, we need to understand what stigma is, how it's manifested, what perpetuates it, and ultimately what we can do to address and eliminate it. So let's start with just a broad definition of stigma. Broadly, stigma is a strong feeling of disapproval that most people in society have about something. The Webster's Dictionary would further that definition by saying it's a mark of disgrace or dishonor associated with a particular circumstance, a quality, or a person. Stigma includes a collection of attitudes and beliefs and behaviors and structures, and they all interact at different levels of society, at the individual level, in groups, in organizations, and in various public systems. Stigma manifests itself in prejudicial attitudes about people with stigmatized conditions or disorders. Stigma also manifests in discriminatory practices against people with certain disorders. Stigmatizing something is a process where a particular social meaning comes to be attached to a category of behaviors and to individuals. It's a social process. As we talk about stigma, some of you might be wondering about the differences between stigma and prejudice and discrimination. And conceptually, stigma and prejudice and discrimination are the same. They share a lot of similar social processes. But the difference is in how researchers have studied stigma and prejudice and discrimination, and the ways that they've studied them are different. Researchers on stigma have traditionally emphasized studying people with certain physical disformities or conditions like HIV or mental illness or a substance use disorder. They focused really on the social processes that relate to social norms and then the deviation from social norms. In contrast, researchers who have focused on prejudice and discrimination have tended to focus more on the implications of the big categories of human behavior like gender, age, class, and race, and how those categories influence the human condition, how those categories have focused on the social processes that have driven exploitation and domination of particular groups of people based on those big categories, race and class and age. Stigmas have been created about many different kinds of health conditions. And interestingly, we know that what is stigmatized by one society or one community might not be stigmatized in another. We also know that stigma can vary depending on the social context. What's considered to be labeled as disgraceful or discrediting or by one group of people might be viewed as benign or celebrated and honored by another group of people. Some examples that come to mind when I think about things that are stigmatized in one group of society or celebrated in another group, I was thinking, like, for example, being an adult who considers themselves to be a non-drinker might be socially accepted in some crowds, even celebrated, whereas that same person might be in another crowd and might feel isolated or socially unaccepted. What is deviant in one culture might be the norm in another culture. Given these various definitions, I think it's clear to see that stigma is a deeply negative mindset that has very little value to society. Because stigma is so complex, researchers have really tried to understand stigma at different levels. And there are 4 different levels of stigma that have been identified. And I think these levels start to allow us to see how stigma is manifested. The first level is public or societal stigma. And this is the public's reaction to individuals with a stigmatizing condition. It's the public's reaction to a person with a substance use disorder or a gambling disorder or a particular mental health condition. Public stigma manifests itself in stereotypes of the group. So stereotypes are essentially the pictures in our heads that we hold about other people. And stereotypes might include believing that those people with a stigmatized condition are dangerous or they are incompetent. It's also manifested in prejudice towards a group and in discrimination. For example, an example might be withholding a potential opportunity from the person with a stigmatized condition. Maybe the person isn't offered a job or they're passed over for housing. Public stigma really creates that social divide between people who have a stigmatized condition and those that don't. So let me give you an example of just one small way that I think societal stigma is manifested. Research is really clear that early identification and early intervention are associated with better outcomes for a number of different conditions. We know that screening and early intervention can reduce negative outcomes associated with lots of different health conditions. If we take substance use, for example, research is really clear that screening and early intervention and referral to treatment can make a big difference and can really help a person before he or she starts to experience bigger and bigger consequences because of their substance use. We know that screening and brief intervention work, and yet stigma can get in the way. People can be reluctant to get screening or to get the help that they need for a substance use issue, even when they think they need it. I recently read a statistic that said approximately 21 million Americans needed treatment for an illegal drug or alcohol use problem, and yet only about 2.5 million people actually received the specialized treatment that they needed. And this makes me it makes me pause and say, how might stigma be perpetuating this huge gap between the number of people who express a need for treatment and the actual number of people who are getting treatment? And while I definitely think there are a number of different factors that play a role, I think it's safe to say that stigma is one factor that can get in the way of early identification and early intervention. Again, if we look at public stigma, it creates that social divide between those that have a particularly stigmatized condition and those that don't. The second level that we can look at in understanding how stigma is manifested is at the self or personal level. Understanding ourselves really requires us to observe and evaluate our own behaviors by comparing our behaviors and choices with other people. It's really natural to make comparisons. We do it every day. And comparing ourselves to others helps us to gauge our own abilities and our own talents. Understanding ourselves also really depends on seeing ourselves through the eyes of other people. Self-stigma is an internalization of society's beliefs that are held. It's really seeing ourselves as other people have categorized us. Self-stigma can manifest in stereotypes of the self. Maybe the person starts to agree with the prejudice or discrimination they've experienced. For example, in response to that prejudice, maybe the person doesn't pursue a work opportunity or housing opportunity. Self-stigma can result in feelings of shame and guilt. It manifests itself of feeling fearful of being judged negatively, being fearful of seeking support or of seeking help. It's the fear of being blamed for your illness or your condition, being afraid that someone might find out about a particular condition or think less of you because of it. It can result in isolation, in a person isolating themselves and withdrawing from the support that they need. Researchers on stigma, Corrigan and Watson, said, self-stigma is really that prejudice which people with various health conditions turn against themselves. The third level of stigma, the third level where we can understand stigma, is at the structural level. And structural stigma really has to do with the policies and procedures that potentially limit the opportunities of people in stigmatized groups. Structural stigma can be found in businesses and in the court systems, in government, within school systems and social service agencies. Unfortunately, structural stigma can almost appear to endorse discrimination, which then can contribute to that public and personal stigma. An obvious example of structural stigma is the Jim Crow laws that limited the rights of African Americans. Another example is prior to 2008, when Congress passed the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equality Act, which ensured equal treatment of mental health conditions and substance use disorders in insurance plans. An interesting study that I came across when I was trying to understand structural stigma was a study that looked at news media and how the news media reports on topics such as mental illness. Mass communication sources like the news media, newspapers, are large social structures that provide information, and these news channels become oftentimes how most Americans learn about what's happening in the world. Unfortunately, how the media frames messages can fuel stigma. The researchers in this particular study looked at over 3,000 news stories about messages about mental illness and categorized them based on how the news story framed that message. They categorized the stories into really 4 big buckets. They categorized them as dangerous. Did they frame the message as dangerousness, blame, treatment and recovery, or advocacy and action? And interestingly, what the researchers found was that 39% of all of those stories, all of those 3,000 stories that they studied, 39% of them focused on dangerousness and violence. The researchers also found that many of those stories on mental health disorders that were in the newspapers had focused on crime and violence and were typically in the front sections of those newspapers, making them even more visible to the reader. While the consequences of policies and procedures that limit opportunities might be unintentional, they can still contribute to stigma. The fourth level of stigma, or how we can understand stigma is manifested, is at the courtesy. It's called courtesy stigma. And public and personal and structural stigma are really the most common frameworks for understanding stigma, but some researchers have also started to identify this fourth level of courtesy stigma. And courtesy stigma is essentially the stigma that's directed towards a family member or a friend of a person who has a stigmatized condition. So the family member doesn't necessarily suffer from the condition or the illness, but because of the condition of his or her loved one, the family member feels isolated and judged, and for some even blamed for the condition. To illustrate courtesy stigma, let me tell you a story. So my first job out of graduate school was as a therapist in an outpatient treatment center that specialized in the treatment for people with substance use disorders. And one of my primary roles in that job was to facilitate a 3-day intensive family program for the inpatient treatment facility. So every other week, families would travel from a variety of different places to attend the family program. And from my time of running the family program, one theme that continued to surface in every single family program that I facilitated was family members expressing their feelings of isolation and loneliness as a result of their family members' substance use disorder. Family members over and over again would express how they almost dreaded being in social situations where they might be asked about their loved one, for fear that if they told the truth about that person, their loved one's substance use disorder, they would be judged or whispered about, or they would end up feeling embarrassed. That fear of judgment and isolation, I think, is a good example of courtesy stigma. So I started to wonder, like, why do certain conditions get stigmatized and others don't? Why does a substance use disorder have stigma associated with it and other conditions like cancer or heart disease don't? Why is it acceptable to talk about a medication for high blood pressure, but less acceptable to talk about a psychotropic medication? Why is it okay to go to the doctor for diabetes and to talk about that, or high cholesterol, but people feel embarrassed or not as willing to talk about seeing a psychiatrist or a mental health professional for a mental health condition? Why are some conditions stigmatized and others aren't? What are the differences? You might be wondering the same thing. So I started to look into the research and started to dive into theory and looking at how have theories started to explain the phenomena of stigma. And I won't go into the details about all the different theoretical foundations that underpin stigma. I do think it's helpful to highlight a couple of the big ideas. One theory is called labeling theory. And labeling theory suggests that a person's self-identity and behavior might be determined or influenced, at least, by the terms that are used to describe or classify them. So, for example, if we label someone, a kid, as a bad kid, if we put that label on that child, through that classification, the child might start to identify and behave in ways that reflect that label. The child who's been labeled that way starts to maybe experience stigma through rejection, isolation, and possible discrimination, which causes that child then to start to adopt that deviant self-concept or to behave in ways that reflect that label, those lowered expectations. And if you think that example, like instead of bad kid, we could use other stigmatized language to describe people, like addict or schizophrenic, or essentially any other language that makes a person an object. And even well-intentioned labels, like survivor, might unintentionally create stigma. Another theory that I think helps us to understand stigma is called attribution theory. And this theory would suggest that we attach meaning to other people's behaviors and to our own behaviors to try and arrive at some type of explanation. So attribution theory is really concerned with how and why ordinary people explain events the way that they do. For example, let's say that you had to go to the bank this morning, and while you were there, you came across a woman talking to one of the tellers. She appears really upset. She looks like physically angry. Attribution theory would say that we're going to try and attach some type of meaning to that person's behavior. So some of us might say, well, that woman is angry. She lacks self-control, or she must have a really bad temper. Others of us might say, well, she's angry because something bad must have happened. She was wronged in some way. That first explanation, that the woman, has a bad temper or she lacks self-control, assigns the cause of her behavior to some internal characteristic rather than to some outside event. That's what we call an internal attribution. An internal attribution assigns meaning about a person's behavior to either their personality or to their motives or to their beliefs. In contrast to that is what's called an external attribution. And external attributions really is the process of assigning the cause of behavior to some situation or to an event that's really outside of the person's control, rather than to some internal characteristic. So in this example, we attribute this woman's anger in the bank to something that bad happened, to a bad experience, or to a situation that's really outside of her control. Attribution theory would suggest that greater stigma is seen when a person judges a condition to be a result of internal attributions versus external attributions that are out of the person's control. And interestingly, as I kind of dug into attribution theory, I started to find research that said we often like to actually explain our own behaviors in ways that attribute our own behaviors to external situations or external influences. When we think about the most common stigmatized conditions, mental health, substance use disorders, perhaps this theory gives us some insight into the attributions that we might be assigning to these conditions that can either perpetuate stigma or attributions that can reduce stigma. So these are the two common theories that researchers have used to understand stigma. In addition to that, researchers have looked at various factors, a variety of different factors that can contribute to stigma. And we're going to talk about 6 factors that I think are salient to understanding stigma. I think these factors they get us closer to understanding why certain conditions get stigmatized and others don't. So the 6 factors we're going to look at are concealability, force, disruptiveness, aesthetic qualities, origin, and peril. And we're going to talk briefly about each of these factors. And as I do, I'd like you to think about each of these on a continuum. On the one end of the continuum, there is little stigma attached. And on the other end of that continuum, there is a lot of stigma attached. And I think each of these factors really lies on this gradient, lies on this continuum somewhere. So the first factor is concealability. And essentially what that is the condition hidden or is it obvious? And essentially, to what extent can a person keep the condition hidden if they choose to? If you think of concealability on that continuum, on the one end, it's where no one knows about a person's condition. It's probably on the low end of that stigma continuum. It's completely hidden. On the other end of that continuum is where there would be a high level of stigma attached to that person's condition. That person's condition is always on display. Everyone can see it. Everyone knows that it's there. Researchers have suggested that people who have stigmatized conditions will often try to conceal their condition when possible. It can be easier for the person, especially in new relationships. And while it might be easier initially, that doesn't mean that that condition has no effect on the person's interpersonal relationships. Intentionally not telling someone about a particular condition, feeling that need to hide that information might lead to guilt or shame and can perpetuate self-stigma. The second factor is course of the condition, and specifically whether the condition is recoverable or not. what's the ultimate outcome of having that condition? Essentially, this looks at how is the condition going to impact the person over time. Researchers have found that non-recoverable conditions tend to attract greater stigma, which we would find then on that high end of that continuum, whereas recoverable conditions tend to attract lower stigma. The most crucial component of this factor is really whether the person can change the course of the condition or not, and whether others believe that the course of that condition can be changed. The third factor is disruptiveness, and essentially how is the condition negatively affecting that person's life and their relationships? Does the condition impact their communication, their interactions with other people? On the low end of that stigma continuum, the condition would minimally disrupt the person's life and their relationships. Whereas on the high end of that stigma continuum, the condition would be highly disruptive. The fourth factor that researchers have looked at is aesthetic qualities. And essentially that's looking at the physical attributes that are caused by the condition. Researchers have shown that on the continuum of stigma, those that have been judged as having less pleasing aesthetic qualities might find themselves more on the low end of the stigma continuum. Whereas if the condition is judged to have less pleasing aesthetics, they might be more prone to stigma. Origin is the fifth factor to consider, and essentially what this one is looking at is under what conditions did the condition originate? How did that condition come to be? And was anyone responsible for it? For example, was it congenital or non-congenital? When did it originate in the person's life? Did it develop rapidly or slowly? And what was the individual's role in acquiring the condition? When looking at origin, two beliefs come into play here. The first one is perceived control, and the second is perceived fault. Perceived control is really our perception about how much control a person has over the condition. Perceived fault is our perception about how much fault the person has in acquiring the condition. When we believe that a person has little control and they acquired that condition really through no fault of their own, we're more likely to attach no stigma to the person or to the condition. In contrast, cancer, I think, is a good example of that. In contrast, I think people will mistakenly believe that someone with, let's say, a substance use disorder, I think people will mistakenly believe that they have a lot of control over the disorder and are partially at fault in having the condition. And that thinking, I think, also applies to a lot of different mental health conditions. So non-stigmatized conditions have low perceived fault and low perceived control. And you would find yourself maybe on the low end of that stigma continuum. Stigmatized conditions often have high perceived control and high perceived fault. And the final factor that I want to talk about today is peril. And that is really just a fancy word for saying what kind of danger is posed by the condition and how imminent or serious is it. A low perception of danger would be on the low end of the stigmatizing continuum. If the condition has a high perception of danger, the person would more likely be on the high end of the stigma continuum. Now, these 6 factors are often researched in the literature, but they're not the only factors that influence the role that stigma plays in various conditions. So we've talked about stigma, we've talked about how it's manifested, and we've started to look at answering the question like, why do some conditions get stigmatized and others don't? And now I want to turn our attention to the ways that we can perpetuate stigma and what we can do to eliminate it. When thinking about like the ways that we contribute to fostering stigma and then what actions we can take to eliminate it, I think we can group those actions into three big categories: language, education, and experiences. So I'm going to start with language. That's the first category. The language that we choose can either perpetuate stigma or reduce it. And the good news about language is that we can change our language. We get to choose the language that we use. SAMHSA's Center for the Application of Prevention Technologies developed a really short document that focused on the language that we use when we talk about substance use disorders and how our words can perpetuate stigma and can reduce it. And I want to highlight a couple of the important examples there that I think really illustrate the importance of and the power of language and how the words we choose can have unintended consequences sometimes. In that SAMHSA document, they presented a quote that I think really represents well the importance of labels and being cautious of the labels that we use. The quote says, "Protest any labels that turn people into things. Words are important. If you want to care for something, you call it a flower. If you want to kill something, you call it a weed." Labels are the words that we use to reference a group. So let me give you two examples of how labels can perpetuate stigma, but also can reduce it. So for example, the statement, Angie has bipolar disorder. Saying it like that, Angie has bipolar disorder, signals that the condition bipolar is separate from the person, Angie. It also conveys that bipolar is essentially a condition that can happen to anyone. By putting the person first, Angie, it conveys that we acknowledge this person has a condition, but she is not the condition. In contrast to that, a statement like, "I talked with a bipolar today," would apply that that label that suggests that person is a member of a category that we call bipolar, who then is different from other people, creating that social divide that I talked about earlier. Another example could be how we talk about a person with a substance use disorder. So saying a person with a substance use disorder puts the person first. It suggests that the person has a problem and that problem can be addressed. In contrast, if we said calling someone a drug addict or a junkie implies that the person is the problem. So we get the opportunity to choose the words we use. So choosing person-first language and avoid describing people as problems. It's a simple shift in our language that can have a big difference, that can make a big difference. We interact with people, and so the language that we choose to use makes a difference. The second category that I think we can look at when we start to talk about taking steps and taking action to eliminate stigma is education. Unfortunately, stigmas resist change, even when evidence fails to support the stigmas that have been created. Stigmas resist change because they're socially created. They're socially created interpretations and categorizations that have been collectively created. And when something's collectively created, we often don't question it. We begin to view those stereotypes and those prejudices as the way things are. We don't challenge our views. We don't challenge our judgments. And when we don't do that, when we don't challenge the social construction that we've created, we can perpetuate stigma. Education, I think, is about countering that. It's about learning new information. To specifically address stigma, education is about learning factual information about stigmatized conditions and then correcting misinformation when we hear it. It's about countering, contradicting the negative attitudes and beliefs, being willing to share information, being willing to seek out new information and to counter misinformation. I think education, getting new information, can also lead us on a journey, a personal journey, to start to challenge our own assumptions. So asking yourself, why do I have certain beliefs about a particular condition or illness, about a particular group of people, about a certain behavior. We got to challenge the way things are, that social construction that we've created. Another component of education, I think, is starting to look at the views we have about ourselves. Perhaps you've let other people's views take hold. Maybe you've started to internalize some of those assumptions. Are those assumptions that you hold holding you back in some way? To address stigma and to work to eliminate it, I think we start with ourselves. We start to challenge our own beliefs and our own assumptions, start to get the education, be open to discussions, and being open to change. The third category, or the third big bucket I think we can look at, is experiences. Like I said, stigma is socially constructed and it's socially transmitted, and stigmas are the product of that socially created interpretation about a certain group of people or certain behaviors or certain conditions. Experiences change our beliefs. We can put ourselves in a position to have intentional experiences, so getting to know someone, experience an issue either directly or vicariously. We know that experiences can change beliefs. Researchers have suggested that people without a stigmatized condition often have very little meaningful contact with people who experienced or who have stigmatized conditions. And that lack of contact can foster distrust. It can foster fear. But I think experiences can really overcome that divide between those who have a stigmatized condition and those that don't. Positive interactions in person or online can really change our attitudes and reduce that social distance. Another component of experiences that I think has some profound effect is really the role of activism. And activism is an experience that changes beliefs. Activism by groups of people who have stigmatized conditions have played a really important role in changing culture. They're organized efforts by various groups essentially to change society's image of that group in some profound ways. And we know that activism and activist groups have been really successful in a number of different ways. And I think in reducing stigma has been one of them. So examples like the gay rights movement or Disabled Veterans of America, those are some examples of how group efforts have started to change the majority's image. Groups essentially acting on their own behalf and confronting those stereotypes have helped to reduce stigma. Advocacy, interestingly, can also engage people who have some investment in stigma change, but they have limited information. They have limited knowledge about how to translate their beliefs into action. It can also energize unengaged stakeholders by raising awareness about particular issues, about raising awareness about the harmful effects of stigma. It can also provide opportunities for stakeholders to develop a sense of common purpose through their organized efforts. We know that experiences can expand our worldviews and allow us to have better understanding of issues, of conditions. Experiences are really that catalyst for changing beliefs. The complexities of stigma, I think, could lead some to conclude that stigma is an unsolvable problem. And to this conclusion, I would say no. We can absolutely do something about stigma. Stigma is a social process, and social processes can change. Through intentional action, we can move our society in a positive direction towards increased connection among people and increased acceptance. Being intentional and taking action can reduce stigma. The language that we choose is important. Being cautious of labels and avoid describing people as problems. Seeking to challenge stigmas by starting at the individual level. What are our own assumptions and challenging our own beliefs? Seeking to learn new information and to correct misinformation. And then finally, seeking intentional experiences. We know that experiences change beliefs. Research study after research study has shown the negative consequences that are associated with stigma. We currently live in a world where some conditions are stigmatized and others aren't. And because of this, people might not get the help they need. They might not stick with the treatments that they've been prescribed. Stigma is complex. It manifests itself in different ways at the societal level and at the personal level and in the structures that we've built. Stigma decreases quality of life. It negatively impacts a person's sense of hope, their self-esteem, and their self-efficacy. What if we could eliminate stigma? I venture to guess that, and to hope, that a world without stigma would be more tolerant, would be more proactive, and would alleviate the suffering of many people. It would improve health and safety. Each of us has a role, and each of us has a stake in that outcome. So if this webinar sparked some interest for you, we're going to be talking more about stigma. I would love to continue this conversation about stigma. We're going to be talking about it at the Center for Health and Safety Culture Symposium coming up this June. It's June 20th through the 22nd in Bozeman, Montana. So you can find out more information about the symposium and to register through our website. We'd love for you to join us there and to keep this conversation going. I really appreciate and thanks for taking time to join me today. I think we do have a couple of questions, and I would definitely take any questions or thoughts that came up for you as we were talking about stigma. Someone commented that in the chat that labeling theory can almost have that self-fulfilling prophecy in addition, and I agree, definitely. I think labeling theory has that role as well of a self-fulfilling prophecy, for sure. Any other feedback or comments? Well, thank you for joining me today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.